Most everyone has seen a movie. Some people have even seen two. Welcome to Why We Love Movies. Hello, welcome to Why We Love Movies. I am your host, Roger Dodger, and today, my guest and we are going to be discussing why we love Star Wars films in honor of National Star Wars Day. So, welcome, Sith.
Thanks, Roger. Glad to be a part of this.
So, I did mention last night that I had a very interesting piece of memorabilia to share with you. And I have something here that I doubt you've ever seen another one of.
Ooh, I'm intrigued.
This
Oh
is
yeah, that's
something
yeah.
that my wife's grandmother, who makes cross stitch for all the grandchildren, this is the one that she made for me. It hangs proudly in my den and is by far the coolest piece of Star Wars memorabilia that I possess.
Oh, that is fantastic. That is custom pieces like that made with love make a collection. That is really nicely done.
And I just wanted to take a second to share this with you. I know that you love this series just as much as I do, and I thought you would just get a kick out of this.
Oh yeah, that is great.
So, alrighty. So, I guess we'll start with just like how you encountered Star Wars for the first time.
Yeah, as a member of Gen X, Star Wars hit me right in my formative years. I was 7 years old when A New Hope was released in movie theaters, and it was just a transformative moment. Up until that point, there had been several Steven Spielberg movies, including Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that had really captured my imagination as a youngster. But then when Star Wars hit the theaters and I got to see that for the first time, that was just something that was, really truly transcendent. And at that particular point in time, sequels weren't something that myself as a 7-year-old child was familiar with. But then, of course, in 1981, when The Empire Strikes Back was released, to see a continuation of this story that I just saw 4 years ago was truly just magical. And to this day, The Empire Strikes Back remains as my favorite movie of all time. And then, of course, 2 years later, on May 25th, 1983, when Return of the Jedi came out, to see that as the kind of the culmination of the series, it just was really fantastic. And like a lot of Gen Xers, I grew up very independent and not necessarily in the smoothest of times all the time. And Star Wars was always there for me. Star Wars provided me with a good structure, a good foundation, and it was always something that I could count on and come back to over and over again. And it helped that I had a best buddy of mine that we were what we colloquially called ourselves Star Wars freaks, and so even had our own little secret handshake and the whole 9 yards. And even to this day, I'm coming to you from my Star Wars room in my house, to where I am surrounded by roughly 2,000 carded Star Wars figures, because even though I'm now in my mid 50s, I still continue to collect Star Wars through to this day. So it's a franchise that is part of my DNA, and continues to be so. And I'm really looking forward to next year, where we get to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the release of Star Wars: A New Hope. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, it's just, I mean, Star Wars movies, TV shows, and I don't think there was ever a time, after Return of the Jedi at least, where it really like died down, where they weren't trying to capitalize on it in some way, rather it be books or they did the radio dramas for the films. And I mean, just to see that something not only had the longevity but managed to keep pumping out stuff for the fans of the series is just huge. And I don't know that there's anything else, any other series like this that you could say that about.
I think you're right, and I think that aside from the period of time between 1985 and 1995, the period I like to refer to as the dark times, because for me, Star Wars was not only always about the movies, but it was always about the toys. And so between the last Power of the Force figures, along with the Ewoks and droids figures that were released in that 1985 timeframe, we had to wait till 1995 until the Power of the Force series came out. And, it was funny because I think a lot of people took a lot of umbrage with the figures at that time because they were the really buff figures, if you recall correctly. And people thought the design had really gone askew. But yet, myself and my buddy, who were still collecting Star Wars toys at the time, we loved the fact that, hey, there's new Star Wars toys on the market. And so that was fantastic that we were finally able to get that. And of course, that sets the stage for 1999 and the release of the Phantom Menace, and of course a brand new toy line to support that movie as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the benefits, I know plenty of people will disagree with me, but one of the benefits of Disney buying the franchises is that we do have continuous content coming out. Now, I tend to be a bit of a purist and an originalist? Sure, I absolutely love the first trilogy the most out of anything. However, when you take a look at things, like one of the things that I just absolutely fell in love with was the Kenobi TV series. Because I recall as a kid reading a magazine interview that was done with George Lucas, centered around a dinner that he was having at his ranch. And somebody had asked him the question during the dinner, how is it that Darth Vader became Darth Vader? And so he told this story about how Darth Vader was previously known as Anakin Skywalker, and he and Obi-Wan Kenobi got into a lightsaber fight at the edge of a volcano, and Anakin Skywalker fell in and was rescued by the Emperor, and as a result became Darth Vader. And so I clung to that story for decades, literally decades. And then Disney, and along with George Lucas and Dave Filoni, brought that story to life in the Kenobi series. And so, like I said, it's just something that to be able to see that, in Revenge of the Sith and then the Kenobi series, further that story, that's just been magic for me. So I'm one of those that thinks, the more Star Wars, the better. Granted, not all Star Wars is created the same, but I do love the amount of content we now have access to.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, and that's one thing that I always, loved about Star Wars because, I mean, even to this day, I'm still finding, like, new, like, books from, like, the 90s where I'm like, wow, I had no idea that that existed. I had no idea that, is, like, more of that because one book that I found was relatively recently was called Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, and it's just a collection of short stories that explains why everybody in the original Star Wars was in the Mos Eisley Cantina, how they got there, what their motivations were, what their backstories were. And I love character building, and that is so rich in just character building and motivations. And so when I got to watch like Tales of the Underworld, Tales of the Jedi, I was just taken back there, and I'm like, this is great, this is fantastic, this is exactly the direction they need to be going in.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that the books and the comics, especially, have all often offered fans of the franchise that extension into a deeper and more vast universe. So when you take a look at the comic books that Marvel had originally put out, again, starting back in the heyday in 1977, there were so many good stories told with just such classic comic art, that I still have all of my Star Wars comics to this day. And then later on into the 90s, when you had Dark Horse enter the market, and Dark Horse started telling stories through the comics, again, just offered this brand new universe to fans that they could explore. But from a book perspective, I will say, when I was a kid, the novelization of Splinter of the Mind's Eye was always just such a fascinating book for me, because that came out, I believe, if I recall correctly, my memory might be a little bit fuzzy, but between Star Wars and Empire, and it just told of this story that was outside of the Star Wars realm that I was used to, and to this day is one of my favorite books. But then more contemporaneously is the From a Certain Point of View series, to where they had released that. I believe the first one was for the 40th anniversary of Star Wars, if I recall correctly, to where it was just a collection, like you had talked about earlier, of short stories that gave this more in-depth view or snapshot into all of these different characters. And then when the 40th anniversary of The Empire Strikes Back came out, they did another rendition of that. And so if you've not had a chance to read From a Certain Point of View, and you do love those kind of short stories that give that deeper breadth of knowledge into these characters as imagined by these fantastic authors that they've recruited for these books, I highly recommend them.
And I will be sure to check those out because that sounds like a lot of fun.
They
And
are. They're great.
and as far as the books go, I think one misstep that Disney is taking is we're getting a new Starfighter movie. I don't remember if it's next year or if they want to do a movie like that, why they aren't just adapting the wonderful X-Wing series. And why they aren't working on something with that, because to me that's like prime for like movie television. And I have not been excited by the couple of images we've seen from this new Starfighter thing movie, and it almost is looking like a Mandalorian copy, which, you know, I was hit or miss. I'm still hit or miss on the Mandalorian.
Yeah, I think that Rogue Squadron offers a great canon to be able to draw from. But to your point, it's, what source material are they using? There's a lot of material out there, and so I do tend to reserve judgment until things come out. And partially, the reason that I do that is I do recall back in 1999 when the Phantom Menace came out, and I remember leaving the theater for the Phantom Menace, and I was blown away. I was like, okay, this is fantastic. I just got done watching this epic Jedi lightsaber duel between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and Darth Maul, and I mean, it was just something that was totally fantastic. And it was funny is you fast forward a few years later, and when Rogue One came out, I went and saw Rogue One, and when I left the theater, I left with a very different feeling. And quite honestly, I didn't know what I was feeling, because what I had just witnessed was a little more akin to a mid-century war movie versus a Star Wars film. There's no lightsabers in Rogue One, and it had a different feel because there was no John Williams score. Even the opening credits were different, and so I had to go back and watch Rogue One for a second time. And when I did so, it clicked with me. I'm like, yeah, this is very different. But yet I fell in love with the movie because it is, I think, just such a fantastic film in the franchise. So yeah, I do tend to reserve judgment a little bit. I've even gone back, on a number of occasions to, rewatch the most recent trilogy. And, that trilogy, probably rightfully so, takes a lot of flack. And what I always say to people is, individually, the movies are fine. It's the disconnect that Disney ran into between the different directors and the different difficulties that they had in production and post production, to where they weren't synced together. And as a result, as a trilogy, it really doesn't work very well. And there were a lot of things that were left on the table that they didn't, explore. And so like I said, individually, they're fine. But back to your point, I do think that there's so much material that's out there. One of the things that I had really been hoping for, and I'm not alone in this. I know a lot of fans have been hoping for is some sort of movie or even a television series based off of Knights of the Old Republic. Knights of the Old Republic has so much good story and characters within the story, but yet it's really just almost solely based on a video game. It really has very little novelization out there that supports it. There's some stuff out there about Darth Bane and Darth Revan, but that a lot of that really comes from the video game. And so I do think that if they did take their time, and again, I've got all the faith in the world in Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau. I mean, Dave Filoni, brought us, Clone Wars and Rebels, and has had played an instrumental part in a lot of the television series that's out there right now. So I mean, I'm sure that if they were to take the time and consider elements of Knights of the Old Republic as canon, I think we could have some great material there. So I keep hope alive, and fingers crossed that one day we'll see that.
So 110%. And that's one thing that we haven't discussed yet are just the video games, because another great one is the Force Unleashed games. Those are fantastic, and I think, with all the new stuff, like the video games, at least the older ones, Knights of the Old Republic, I mean, I played Jedi Academy and, Star Wars Racer and all of those, but like Force Unleashed was such a great story that hadn't really been touched or really thought about since, the second one came out back in, I think it was like 2010.
And I think you're absolutely right. You're hitting the nail on the head. Is that The Force Unleashed was such a fun video game and steeped in such really fun lore that they expanded off of that and did action figures and different things to help accompany the video game. Now, you could make the argument to say that the figures that were done to support The Force Unleashed was just clever marketing by Hasbro. But really, at the end of the day, even when you go back to George Lucas's original agreements with Kenner, I mean, that is where the bucks were really made, was the fact that George Lucas struck a genius deal with Kenner back in the day to really retain a lot of the rights for the toys, because no one thought, hey, is this guy really going to make anything? Nothing like that had ever been done before, and that really did launch an empire, pun intended. And so, but I mean, I do think that The Force Unleashed is kind of proof positive that that was not only a game that was loved by the fans and by gamers alike, but like I said, it spawned action figures to be developed for it, and as a result, lives as one of a fan favorite out there in the universe.
And I mean, I completely agree with you. And earlier we were equal trilogy, and I was kind of having a conversation with a buddy of mine the other day, and because I also recently rewatched the sequel trilogy, and I'm like, I think The Last Jedi, the middle one, is a top 5 Star Wars movie. Out of all of them, I think it's up there. There's a lot of great stuff in that, and I wish they had worked with that and worked off of that instead of pivoting as hard as they did, because a lot of the fans rejected it and didn't like it, so they were like, well, we gotta pivot, let's pivot fast, and let's pivot hard.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the biggest kind of unpulled threads in that whole trilogy was Finn's story. Because I mean, it was more than just implicit that he was force sensitive. And so, they could have gone down, I think, a much longer road there to go ahead and pull that thread to figure out, okay, how is he really fitting into this story? And I do think to this day that is kind of one of the biggest unanswered questions, as well as the fact that there was a great opportunity, and even George Lucas had, I think, asked this question at one time, is that, okay, Disney, you guys have the reins to this franchise. You now have the ability to bring back Princess Leia, Han Solo, and Luke Skywalker together in a reunion on screen. Why don't you do that? And I think from what I've been able to see, the response to that was too much fan service. And it's like, well, if you're not doing this for the fans, I'm not exactly sure who you're doing this for. But I mean, that I think was a big missed opportunity. Of course, one of the things that I was really left, my mouth literally open, jaw touching the floor at the end of The Force Awakens, is the fact that we do get Luke Skywalker, which, when Luke appears on screen, I'm not too man enough to admit that I started to tear up because, oh my gosh, there's Luke Skywalker on screen after all these years. And then that's it. And it's like, wait a second, that's it. That's all we get of Luke Skywalker. So yeah, I mean, I do think that, again, as standalone films, each of them have their own merits. I do appreciate the Kylo Ren aspect of it. And is he Sith? Is he not Sith? That question still, remains to this day. But at the end of the day, like I said, I think that there was just too much that was unresolved there. Very similar to the Solo movie. When you take a look at the Solo movie, and at the very end of it, you might remember as Kira takes off in the casino ship and leaving Han and Chewie on the surface of the planet, and she has that hologram communication with Darth Maul as a part of Crimson Dawn. And there was, I think, a lot more story to tell there that hasn't been told as of yet. I think it's been explored a little bit in comics, but at the end of the day, there's still some threads to be pulled there. So, like I said, the Star Wars universe is fantastic. It's chock full of possibility, and in the right hands, I think that those stories can be well told.
I completely agree with you, and I mean, so I haven't watched it yet because I'm waiting for all of it to come out, but I am really excited to see this new Maul series on Disney Plus and to see what they kind of do with that, because that is one character that, especially in books, there's just so much about him. He's such a fascinating, complex character, and I am so happy that he's getting his own series, and I, can't wait to see what it entails.
Like you, I have held off on watching it, partially because I tend to be more of a binge watcher, to where I'll sit down and I'll binge the entire series. And that is one that I'm looking forward to watching, because I will say that, while you can make the argument to say they did him dirty in the Phantom Menace by having a Padawan cut him in half. And granted, I mean, while he did dispense with Qui-Gon Jinn, a Jedi Master, overall, well, and let me correct myself, he wasn't a Jedi Master because he refused to join the Council. He was a Jedi Knight, but still, a Sith apprentice dispatched Qui-Gon, and then you had a Padawan dispatch Darth Maul, and they kind of did him dirty a little bit. What was fantastic, what Dave Filoni did with that story afterward in Rebels, was fantastic, in Clone Wars and in Rebels, to where they breathed new life into Darth Maul, to where he continued to have that story. And again, there are moments throughout Star Wars to where, again, a tear comes to my eye. One of the first times was the cremation of Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi, that Luke performs in the Forest of Endor. That was one of the first times that I think Star Wars kind of made me tear up a little bit. But when we take a look at that final scene in the episode of Rebels, Rebels to where Qui-Gon, or not, sorry, not Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan and Ezra are in the desert of Tatooine. Ezra tracks him down, and Maul was following Ezra because obviously Maul was using Ezra, and then Obi-Wan and Maul have that final battle. I mean, that was just, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps even talking about it because I remember that scene so vividly. And Filoni had just done such a fantastic job with that. So as long as Filoni's fingerprints are on the Maul series, I feel confident that that will be done well. Very similarly to how they've treated Asajj Ventress's character in a lot of the offshoots. You had mentioned Tales of the Jedi earlier and Tales of the Sith. I think that they've done a fantastic job breathing new life into the character of Asajj Ventress, which, again, there's a book, if I recall correctly, I think it's called Dooku, and there's this exploration of Asajj Ventress being Count Dooku's apprentice, which Dooku had no business having an apprentice. If you're following the rule of two, you're not supposed to have that. Yet he did have that apprentice in Asajj Ventress, and that book does a great job of diving deeper into Asajj Ventress's story and how and her life with the Night Sisters. I'm looking forward to the Maul series as well.
Definitely. So, one other thing I love discussing with people in terms of Star Wars, going back to the original trilogy, I, like you, the first time I watched them, didn't get to see them in theaters, unfortunately. I was about 25 years too late, give or take. And, but growing up, my aunt, when they came out on DVD back in, I think it was 2007 or 8, they released these limited editions where the first disc was the special edition, and the bonus disc was the original theatrical version pulled from laser discs. And so those bonus discs were my first introduction because my aunt was also purist, and she would not watch the special editions if she could help it. Before those, she had them all taped off of TV from back in the 80s and 90s, and so, when I watched the special editions for the first time, when I got them on Blu-ray, I was like, this is so... It was jarring. It was just all the CGI that was put in the weird places, the Jabba the Hutt scene, like all of it, especially in New Hope is where it seems to be the heaviest. It's just, there's just so much. So as somebody who got to actually, watch them in theaters and experience them the first time like that, what were your thoughts when they rolled out those special editions?
The word you used nailed it on the head, and that was jarring. Because to your point, right? I mean, so I got to see them in the theaters growing up, and even in what was it in the mid '80s, as cable TV was starting to come out here in Arizona, we had something called On TV, ONTV, and I still remember, and in fact, I think I have it somewhere in my collection, to where they would send out what would be essentially like TV guides. And I remember when Star Wars was announced for being released on cable TV and was going to come to On TV, and I got so excited. And so when, you hear people talk about the fact that they've seen a movie, dozens of times or, maybe 50 times, I've literally seen the Star Wars movies hundreds of times because I just grew up. I mean, I'm one of the most annoying people to watch Star Wars with because I can quote you the dialogue throughout the movie. And I mean, I love the dialogue of the movies, and so I grew up to them with Star Wars being just part of my DNA, like I talked about earlier. And so to see the special editions, it took me out of it. is really the best way to describe it, because I was so used to the way that they, had originally been done. But George Lucas is not terribly different from Walt Disney. So when Walt Disney had first built Disneyland, he had built that specifically for the purpose of continued evolution. Walt did not see Disneyland as something that stayed static. He wanted it to continue to improve, for it to continue to evolve, for it to continue to grow. And so Lucas is very similar in that aspect when it comes to Star Wars. And part of the reason why is if you've ever watched any of the making of documentaries of the original trilogy, and you're watching them back in 1975 and 1976 in basically these parking lots in Southern California as they're filming the different scenes for like the Battle of the Death Star. I mean, they're literally in a parking lot using these hoist cameras to film these, kind of Death Star battle trench scenes. And so a lot of that stuff, the special effects back then, they were doing literally by hand. And so I think that as technology has evolved, George Lucas gets very excited. He's like a kid in a candy shop, to where he sees the opportunity to do new things and go back and mess with it, to try to do things that he couldn't do in the past, that actually came closer to what his vision was. So like I said, I understand why he went that direction, but again, to your point, is that having grown up with it and having seen it in a certain manner or a certain way, when I first saw the special editions, they took me out of it. And so that's one of the best things that I love about Laserdisc, is the fact that I have so many different versions of Star Wars on Laserdisc. If you've seen that video that I've done on Instagram, to where it shows all the different versions of Star Wars that I have, is I can go through and pick and choose which version that I want to watch. And luckily, as a result of Laserdisc, there are some very nice preserved copies of basically the original trilogy prior to the special editions, that are, nice looking, that do present well on your big screen at home. So I absolutely love those. Will I watch the special editions every once in a while? Maybe when I'm falling asleep at night, I'll throw it on Apple TV just to go ahead and have something to fall asleep to. Maybe it's more John Williams music than anything, but overall, like I said, do prefer the way that they originally came out.
And and I know that like he gets excited because it can match his vision, and it is what he originally envisioned. And I feel like I would be more okay with it if they didn't try to like bury the originals like it was like a dead dog in the backyard. Like, and if you go and like look at some George Lucas stuff in the 80s, he speaks very adamantly about how you shouldn't change things like original works of art. You shouldn't have the ability to do that, and they need to be preserved. And then he turns around and goes, "Oh well, I like this better this way. We're just gonna completely erase all that other stuff. We don't need to talk about that. We can just shove that over here in a pile." And and I think that's what frustrates me the most, is just the hypocrisy behind all of it, of just how hard he's tried to bury not only the original trilogy, but some of the like Star Wars media, because as flawed as it is, I mean, the Star Wars Holiday Special is Star Wars media, and we don't get releases of that. And I just feel like, and that's one thing that, again, Disney's even decided to restore the original theatrical version, and they're showing it in London, I think, for the 50th anniversary. I don't know if it's making it to the States or not, but I know that they are doing a showing in London of the original theatrical version of Star Wars.
Yeah, from what I understand, I think we are going to get a wide theatrical release of the original version come next year in celebration of the 50th anniversary. And so I do think that that is going to come out because they've heard us loud and clear that we want that. But again, right? I mean, you got to give Disney credit where credit is due. Disney's a money making machine, and so they know that if they release the theatrical version in theaters next year, people will flock to see it. And then, of course, there'll be a 4K Ultra release, and I mean, everything will come after that. And if they're smart about it, they'll do 50th anniversary action figures, things of that nature. So, I mean, I don't fear that we won't have access because we certainly will. But I think going back to George and his kind of thoughts on it is that yeah, I mean, I think that he was very proud of what he had done and didn't want to mess with it until he started, hanging out with people like, James Cameron, or, he spun up ILM and started seeing some of the things that ILM was capable of doing with technology. And that's where I think his mindset started to shift a little bit. The other piece, and this is the harder part that I think that people my age have a hard time digesting is that yeah, we Star Wars Empire and Jedi came out during our foundational years when we were kids, our formative years. And but then by the time that Phantom Menace came out, many of us were in our late 20s, early 30s. And that was filmed at a different time when we're no longer in our formative years. But yet George very much had children still in mind for his, space fantasy slash cowboy opera. And so when you think about characters like Jar Jar Binks, for instance, right? So many people my age have to go ahead and make peace with Jar Jar Binks because we believe that he's a secret Sith Lord. But at the end of the day, though, I think that what we have to take into account is the fact that characters like Greedo or Walrus Man or Hammerhead or even R2D2 and C3PO, those were endearing to us because we were children at the time that those movies were released. So when we fast forward to 1999 or 2001 or 2003, when it comes to the next trilogy, there's a lot of elements there that don't resonate with us, but we're also not children. And even Lucas sticking, his own children into Revenge of the Sith, specifically during the opera scene, where Anakin's running to meet with Palpatine in his opera box. He's running past George Lucas and his children dressed up in character, standing there in that hallway. And so again, George had a different, I think, vision in mind, but at the end of the day, he again was recognizing that a lot of his core audience were going to be younger children. And when you talk to, perhaps, millennials or even Gen Z, that second trilogy, where again, if you go back to the purists, we didn't care for the second trilogy too much until Revenge of the Sith came out. And Revenge of the Sith really closed that gap for us. And we're like, okay, we're fans, we're sold. But we weren't necessarily digging, episode one and episode two very much, because of Jar Jar Binks and a lot of the silliness of the battle droids and whatnot. But if you talk to millennials or even Gen Z, that second trilogy, that is their holy grail. So, just, you got to remember, how it is that how old you were when you first saw those movies and how it hits you differently. And so that's one of the things I always try to take with a grain of salt as I watch the different films across the timeline.
So my aunt, she 1977, she was watching them in theaters, and she also hated it, couldn't stand it. So because of that, she was more of a casual fan. So like she was like, okay, I don't like where they go with this. I don't like what they're doing with this. So she skipped Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And it wasn't until 2016 that I finally was like, no, just give these other two a shot. watch them. She watched Attack of the Clones, still wasn't taken with it. And then she watched Revenge of the Sith, and she was like, "This is amazing. This is good. Why couldn't they all have been this good?"
Yeah, I think it always comes down to the storyline, and it's you're finally again, your aunt sounds like she's the same age as me to where, for her, that Revenge of the Sith storyline is closing that loop from 30 years prior to where we're finally seeing, okay, how is it that Darth Vader came to be? But it is funny though too. I always like to remind my peers in my age group that they harp on these new movies and stand by the fact that the original trilogy is the best, and I agree with them on that. But I also casually remind them that they hated the Ewoks. Return of the Jedi, when Return of the Jedi came out in 1983, there were a lot of my peers in my age group to where they loved the biker scouts, they loved the second Death Star, they loved that space battle scene, but they hated the murder bears. They could not stand the Ewoks whatsoever. And so they kind of casually forget that. But at the end of the day, again, that was George Lucas's focus, is he wanted to make sure to have children in mind as he was continuing to tell this story. And originally Ewoks were supposed to be much more ferocious. They were supposed to be very similar to Wookiees in their nature. And so he ended up having to go ahead and tone it down a little bit. But then again, if you think about it for just a few moments, how did the Ewoks have all these empty stormtrooper helmets and their uniforms lying around? What did they do with the stormtroopers? If you think too much about it, that's when you colloquially will refer to Ewoks as murder bears going forward.
and and I mean, the first time I watched Return of the Jedi, I was younger, and I remember going, "Oh well, this is the best one of the three. This is it. This is because you had all those things the children are going to be into. You had Jabba the Hutt, you had all the different creatures, you had the Ewoks, but you also had the epic space fight between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and you had Han Solo doing his thing, and so I mean, and Strikes Back, like Empire Strikes Back, is the best of the original three. It's the most story driven, it's the most character driven, and I mean, but that just kind of shows to your point that like children love, like my 3 year old, he loves all three of them, but he loves Return of the Jedi, and because that was your target audience. It was children, and it works. But it also works at giving the people who had been following the story, a satisfying conclusion to the arc they had been following.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you go back to that space battle when the Rebel Alliance arrives at Endor, and obviously it's to quote Admiral Akbar, it's a trap. And they turn around and they start fighting the Imperial forces there above Endor. At that time, that was some of the most complicated and special effects heavy scenery that had been filmed in cinema to that date. And there's a reason, like there's a poster that I have floating around here somewhere to where it's got a multitude of the ships, and with the Falcon right there in the middle, and you've got your TIE interceptors and your B wings and your A wings and your Y wings and your X wings and your TIE fighters. I mean, that was some of the most special effects intense scenery that had been filmed at that particular time. So when you take that and you combine that with finally that final duel between Vader and Luke in the throne room, and the clash of the red and the green lightsabers, along with John Williams' soaring score. I mean, that was just such a perfect ending to that film. And then, of course, all of a sudden we realize that this doddering old man that's been sitting on this throne the whole time, oh, wait a second, he's the most powerful guy in the room here because now he's shooting these, fantastic purple blue lightning bolts out of his fingers. It was just something that we never even knew about until that point. And so again, I mean, Jedi, for many people, Jedi is their favorite, and I totally support that. I get that. For many, New Hope is their favorite because New Hope is what, introduced them to the franchise, and that's, their first memories of Star Wars. But to your point, my favorite is Empire because the story is there. It has that cliffhanger aspect at the end of the film, and you're just in this society of instant gratification. People don't remember is that back in 1981, we were left on the hook for over 2 years to figure out exactly just what in the heck was going to happen, with Return of the Jedi. And if, as many people remember, at first it was introduced as Revenge of the Jedi. And it wasn't until, before the film was released that it was, turned to Return of the Jedi. So, we were left on the hook for 2 years to figure out how does this story come to a conclusion. And George Lucas did not disappoint us.
100%. And, I'm with my wife and her family when it came out. And I left the theater, and the first thing I did was call my brother, who, is just a Star Wars fan right there along with me, and we would always go watch them together. And I called him, and I'm like, I'd rather watch Return of the Jedi. I'm like, you should just watch Return of the Jedi. And he goes, was it that bad? And I'm like, not only was it bad, but it was similar. And he's like, how similar? And I'm like, well, remember how in Return of the Jedi, during the final space battle, Lando's flying the Millennium Falcon? And he's like, well, yeah, of course. And I'm like, well, see, in this movie, in the end, in the final space battle, well, Lando's flying the Millennium Falcon. And I'm like, it was just, they took some of the best parts of Jedi and then just completely muddled the rest of the story, and it was messy. And I think that was my biggest problem is I saw that they were trying to do Return of the Jedi, but they were coloring with crowns.
Yeah, so George Lucas is famous for this quote that he has to where he talks about the fact that history or art rhymes. And as a result, sometimes it can repeat. And so, does he kind of use his own material to kind of influence him a little bit? Yeah, absolutely, he does. And so, I do think that there is absolutely that aspect of that to where he will go ahead and kind of reference back to things that have worked in the past to go ahead and do that. But again, that's where we also Disney tends to be a little gatekeeperish sometimes with regard to what they will allow in as canon and what they won't allow as canon. And so that's where, going back to the books and some of these authors that are, out there, Timothy Zahn is fantastic to where, Timothy Zahn has done a series of books, specifically with the Heir to the Empire series, to where he's got a lot of stuff out there, or even the Thrawn series. The Thrawn series is what Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau have called upon to go ahead and help influence the Ahsoka TV series. So there's a lot of material that's out there for them to be able to reference and to plumb. And so it's just a matter of them not being terribly gatekeeperish about it, to where they can actually go through and work with these authors and work with these fantastic storytellers to where they don't necessarily have to retell the same story over and over again.
100%. And to go back to the topic of, things that I would just love to see, there's one more book that I really love, and it is called, I want to say it's called Death Troopers. But essentially, it is a zombie outbreak aboard a stormtrooper vessel. And that is one of the best cross genre books I've ever read. because it blends the sci-fi and the horror so seamlessly and so well. And it also shows that, you can take this established universe and tell, all kinds of stories. They don't all have to be so sci-fi. They don't all have. I think that is, set Rogue One apart was it was so different. It didn't feel like a sci-fi film. It felt like a war film. It felt like a almost like a war thriller. And I would love to see them do more of that and lean more into that. The Mandalorian has a very Western feel to it, as did the Book of Boba Fett. And so I really love seeing that they are doing that, where they're trying to do that kind of cross genre thing with it.
Yeah, and I think that that's where you also saw a little bit of that in the Ahsoka series, right? So where you had, again, you had Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau kind of pulling from different elements of the Star Wars universe, and so they incorporate the Night Sisters, they incorporate Morgan Elsbeth in there to where basically Morgan Elsbeth is really kind of, trying to become she's really a Night Sister apprentice almost, and so they go to where Thrawn is been banished, if you will, or marooned, and he's got the Night Sister witches with him, and so that's exactly what they do is they create basically the Night Troopers, or these zombies, to where all of a sudden, Ahsoka and the team are trying to go ahead and battle them, and they're having the hardest time doing it because they're basically the undead. So, yeah, I mean, that was, I think, a really fun element, and that's where I think that 2026 is going to be a fantastic year for Star Wars, and I can't help but feel like um, that Disney's kind of done this on purpose as it relates to how Star Wars is rolling out. So you've got obviously the new Maul series, you've got the new Mandalorian movie that's coming out at the end of the month, which, again, I know people are already up in arms about it. I'm reserving judgment for it. I'll go to the theater and see it, which I really don't go to the theater much anymore as it is, but I'll go to the theater and see that because I can't pass up an opportunity to see Star Wars in the movie theater. But then you also have the Ahsoka series, continuing later on this year, as well as, if I'm not mistaken, I think we might actually get another series of Andor. And so, which, again, you think about things that are a true departure from the original Star Wars series, just as Rogue One was a bit of a departure from the Star Wars universe, Andor, again, that was something that was completely different in the Star Wars universe, and people ate it up. People loved it. And so I have to say that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of Andor. I enjoyed it, and I definitely have watched it again. But when I take a look at how I rank the TV series, again, I know in a bit of a minority, but Kenobi for me is really one of my best favorite series. I know a lot of people really kind of prefer Mandalorian, others prefer Andor, but I prefer Kenobi, and I really also love Ahsoka. I think Ahsoka is just a fantastic addition to the franchise, and I'll even go a step further to say that I enjoyed the Acolyte, and I know people hated the Acolyte. But I gotta say is that the reason I think people hated the Acolyte is because the storytelling was maybe a little bit too slow in that, and they weren't really sure where it was going. And I do think one of the biggest mistakes that we're going to come to regret late as years pass is the fact that they did preview Darth Plagueis right at the end of that series, and I would have loved to have seen what happened there, because why is Plagueis still alive? Plagueis is supposed to have been murdered by Sidious, and he's actually still out there pulling the strings. And I would have loved to have seen that story continue. But from what I can tell, we're not going to get that. And that's, I think, unfortunate, because I think that there would have been a good story to tell there.
So I completely agree with you on Kenobi. I still haven't finished The Acolyte. It's one that, I got I was like, okay, we're gonna switch, move something else, move to something else, and I never went back. But I am with you that Kenobi is probably the best of the series that have come out, because to me that really finished Kenobi's story. That finished it in much the same way that the book did, back in 2005 or 6. And another series that I really liked, and I think I'm in the minority, I don't hear people talk about it, is the Skeleton Crew series. That's another one that I think suffered from the same thing the Acolyte did, in that it started out slow, it was very children focused, but those last 2 episodes where everything's just flipped on its head is so good. And the writing and the fact that they were brave enough to sit there and go, oh no, we're going to completely take you down this train of thought and then flip it around on you, is just so unique and intriguing to me.
And this is where I fear you may ask for me to hand over my Star Wars fan club membership card here, but Skeleton Crew is I had the same experience that you had with the Acolyte, to where I watched the first couple of episodes and I have never gone back to go ahead and watch the rest of it. And I need to. And I have a feeling when I sit down to watch Maul, I'll probably end up doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think to your point, it was like, for me, when that had first started, the thing that it reminded me of, and I'm going to really show my age here, and you may not necessarily get this reference, but what it reminded me of was the end of the Battlestar Galactica series, to where they actually ended up on Earth. And so it was this clash of the fantasy world of Battlestar Galactica with the real world of Earth. And, all of a sudden you had, these colonial troopers that were actually on Earth and mingling with humans. And it just, that always felt so weird to me. And so when Skeleton Crew had started off, I immediately got that feeling. I'm like, wait a second, why are they, and I know it wasn't necessarily meant to be Earth, but
Right.
that's what it felt like to me. It felt very much like hey, Star Wars has come to real life. And for me, it's all about a galaxy far, far away, and so for them to have brought that so close to an Earth feeling, it felt weird to me. But then when you also couple it with what you were just talking about, and that was the fact that it did feel very kiddie like, until the last 2 episodes. Again, I haven't finished the series yet, so you've given me a reason to go do so now. But yeah, like I said, that's one that I need to still pick up.
So, I mean, I do not like Battlestar Galactica 1980.
Yeah,
That's in a cool little Cylon head. I love it. Um,
I have that as well.
but yeah, no. And for me, it was like, okay, this is like, but like I said, those last 2 episodes. So, homework. I guess you'll finish up Skeleton Crew, and I'll go back and finish up the Acolyte. And
Yep, yeah, Acolyte, like I said, it was Book of Boba Fett's one of those to where I have to say again, hopefully from this discussion you've found that I'm very open-minded and I'm always welcoming of more Star Wars. And Book of Boba Fett, I was left scratching my head as I was watching it, going, "What the heck am I watching here?"
and honestly, I don't think it was needed. Like, I don't think it skip it. Like,
Yeah, yeah, I was left with the fact that it kind of felt like Star Wars meets Power Rangers. To your point, it was
right.
not really necessary.
And I think that even Disney knew it, and that's why they started bringing in the Mandalorian, and why they started like slowly pivoting the plot that way, was because they were like, oh well, people aren't digging this, or people aren't gonna dig this. Let's make sure that they have to watch it.
Yeah, exactly. And I even remember when that happened, where all of a sudden you saw Din Djarin open up. I think it was like the fourth or fifth episode of Book of Boba Fett, and it's like, you could tell this was a bit of a life preserver for the series, because this was, I think, prior to the third season of Mandalorian, to where, admittedly, the end of the third season of Mandalorian was a bit of a head scratcher as well, because it was like, okay, here's Grogu and Din Djarin on a ranch somewhere, and are they going to live happily ever? That was kind of a weird ending for me. But prior to that, you had Book of Boba Fett, and all of a sudden, this life preserver was thrown in for the series, and so yeah, I think everybody picked up on that, to where it's like, okay, this thing needs a little bit of breath of fresh air, and they did exactly that by introducing the Mandalorian into that series.
and and that is one thing, that is one bit of Star Wars trivia that I will always love in regards to Boba Fett, is when he falls into the Sarlacc pit in Return of the Jedi. Like, that was not the first time he had fallen into that particular Sarlacc pit. And if you read enough of the like books and stuff, that was like the third or fourth time he's fallen into that particular Sarlacc pit.
And that's the benefit of the Mandalorian armor, is that where most people would have, as you think about the scene in Return of the Jedi, to where, Luke is taking over Jabba's sail barge, and you have all of these different characters who are falling into the Sarlacc pit. Most of them are dying fairly quickly, because they're getting caught on the Sarlacc's razor sharp teeth. But when Boba Fett falls in there, he's got the Beskar armor, so he's very well protected. So when he gets in there, he has that ability to fight his way out. And so it's not easy, as we saw in Book of Boba Fett, but
Right.
still, he has the ability to.
And she was like, "Well, how are they bringing Boba Fett back? Like, he falls into the pit." And I'm like, "Well, that's not the first time he's done it. Like, he's
Yeah,
escaped before."
yeah.
And but day, happy Star Wars Day.
Absolutely. May the fourth be with you. I enjoyed spending some time with you today, and talking about my all-time favorite franchise. And like I said, did so from my Star Wars room. So it's always nice to get surrounded by 2,000 of my best friends. And so I also clearly need to dust in here.
May the fourth be with you as well. Do you want to give a shout out to anything in particular where people can find
I think, yeah, if anybody wants to follow me on Instagram, they can do so at Sith Lord Vader Laserdiscs. Also a pretty prominent seller of Laserdiscs on the Whatnot app. And then you could also find me on eBay, selling Laserdiscs on eBay at Sith Lord Vader Laserdiscs. So always happy to go ahead and meet new people and answer any questions that people have, either about Star Wars or about Laserdiscs. Like I said, the Laserdisc format is a fantastic way to keep the Star Wars flame burning, and always happy to go ahead and talk to new people and answer any questions that they may have.
well, definitely be sure to check him out on Whatnot. I mean, as I'm sure you guys know from my past Laserdisc videos, I'm no stranger to purchasing from him. He's great, but this is Roth, and this is why we love movies. Thank you.